Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for yet another public lecture by Professor Joel Gerboff. This time, this is part of the various lectures of the Center for Jewish Studies, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with me by now. I'm Chavat Yor Samuelson. I'm the Director for Jewish Studies at ASU. I'm Irving and Miriam Low Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History. Now, this month, the center has quite a busy schedule. I want to bring to your attention the lectures by Rabbi Richard Adres. There are 3 lectures, one on February 20th, one on Monday, February 27th, and the last one on March 6th. They're all going to be at the same time, which is this time slot, namely 12 o'clock AZ time. And they will focus on living longer and living better, basically how to think about the challenges of aging in our own day. So I encourage all of you to share it with other friends and bring other people as well. I think it should be a very, very interesting mini lecture, kind of a lecture series. Then on Sunday, February 26th, we will hold an international conference on Judaism, Jews, and artificial intelligence. Again, a very contemporary and important topic. Actually, Rabbi Adres will also participate in that conference, and we will have people from literally all over the world, from Europe, from Israel, from Latin America, from England, to help us reflect on the challenges of living with technology. This afternoon, we are going to be enjoying a lecture by Professor Joel Gerboff about the role of Jewish Historical Society and their contribution to the formation of American Jewish communal life. Now, this topic is very relevant to people here in Phoenix and actually to what we are doing right now. Here in Phoenix, as many of you know, there is a very vibrant Jewish Historical Society, and that society has contributed greatly to Jewish education and to Jewish communal life. Maybe I can also say to Jewish collective identity. Jewish historical societies are really instrumental, have been instrumental in spreading or disseminating the academic study of Judaism, even though they are not technically academic societies, but they are very important for academic research because they curate and they preserve a lot of the documents that scholars need in order to do the work about American Judaism and any other topic that relates to Jewish life. No one could better explain the contribution of Jewish historical societies than Professor Gerboff, who, together with another professor, Jonathan Friedman. I actually don't know Jonathan Friedman, so maybe Joel, you can tell us more about him as well. They just co-edited a book under the title "Local and Regional Jewish Historical Societies: Navigating the Professional-Amateur Divide," and that's really a question: how can non-academics contribute and vice versa? So this book is going to come out by Texas Tech University Press any day, as far as I understand. Right. And many of you are familiar with Professor Gerboff since he's been really crucial to introducing Phoenix and ASU in particular to the discipline of Jewish studies. Professor Gerboff established Jewish studies at ASU in 1978 when he joined the Faculty of Religious Studies as assistant professor. In 1983, he was promoted to associate professor, and he served as the chair of the Department of Religious Studies from 1998 to 2008, so that's a full decade. And many of you probably remember that he was also the interim director of Jewish Studies program from 2005 to 2008, after Jack Kugelmas left Jewish Studies and before I became director at the end of 2008. And on top of all this, he also serves as a faculty head within what is now the amalgamated school. It's called the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and he's been the head faculty of Religious Studies. So he's done a lot of administrative work, both at ASU, at the university, and also beyond in the profession as a whole. He's the past president, if I'm not mistaken, of the Jewish now I have to get the title right, Society of Jewish Ethics. So he is very involved in that. Now, he holds a PhD from Brown University. He did his work with Jacob Neusner. Jacob Neusner, many probably are familiar with his name, was very important in professionalizing Jewish studies in America, and he was a major, major scholar of Rabbinic Judaism. So the first book of Professor Gerbov is on a rabbinic figure, on Rabbi Tarfon. It came out as a book under the title Rabbi Tarfon, The Traditions, the Men, and Early Rabbinic Judaism. That came out in 1979. And since then, he moved into many other dimensions of Jewish studies. And I'll just mention the titles of 3 of his edited volumes. One title, which actually I'm very glad to know your interest in music. So one of those volumes, it's called Kino, The Biblical Lyre in History, Thought, and Culture. That was published by Claremont School of Theology Press, 2021. He's also a very important scholar of American Judaism, and he has another edited volume on non-denominational Judaism, perspectives on pluralism and inclusion in 21st Jewish professional education. That came out also in 2021. And a third volume called Kol Tamid, The Shofar in Ritual History and Culture. That came out in 2017, also from Claremont School of Theology Press. So those titles, as well as the title of the current book, and one more book that will be coming out, Torah Service Deeds, Jewish Ethics and Trans-Denominational Perspective, gives you a sense that Professor Gerbov covers very complex and interdisciplinary intersection, I should say, of religious studies, sociology and anthropology of religion, of ethics, of rabbinics, of Jewish history, and American Judaism. So we are very privileged to listen to him tell us a little bit more about Jewish historical societies. And the title is All History is Local, the Role of Local and Regional American Jewish Historical Societies. So Joel, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Chava, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful always to have an opportunity to speak through Jewish studies at ASU, and on a personal level to watch the growth of the program from when we started it now 45 years ago. Hard to imagine, and to see how it's flourished, especially under the directorship of Dr. Tiro Samuelson, and expanding to have a national and truly an international importance. Also continuing to promote programs of interest to those in the local community as well. I want to speak a little bit autobiographically to set the context of what I want to talk about in terms of local Jewish historical societies. I grew up in Rhode Island, and my attending Brown for graduate school is a kind of ironic aspect of my life, not topic for today. But growing up in Rhode Island, of course, being the smallest of all the states, maybe Rhode Island suffers from something of an ego identity, so it tends to want to maximize its importance in American history. And it's truly the case. Rhode Island is an important part of the formation of the United States, being one of the 13 original states and having a long history to it. And one can walk around Providence, and especially on Benefit Street, if you're familiar, and you see all the old colonial houses, and you have a real sense of connection to a past that is deeply instilled in you if you just observe what is going on around you. Of course, growing up in Rhode Island also, I quickly learned, as anybody knows, Rhode Island is the home to the oldest synagogue building that still exists in the United States, the Touro Synagogue in Newport. It's not the oldest synagogue, but it's the oldest synagogue building. And it's on the normal tourist map of everybody. And I can't tell you how many times somebody would come and visit, and we'd spend about an hour in Providence, and then we'd go head off to Newport, and we'd go visit the Touro Synagogue as the oldest synagogue in America. I also learned, though, along the way, that Rhode Island is also the oldest of all the Jewish local historical societies that exist. And my mother was quite active in it, and she would bring home what is known as the Rhode Island Jewish Historical Notes, a publication that has continued to exist until today, published annually, and is one of a number, now a small number, of journals published by local Jewish historical societies. So I had this kind of interest in this phenomenon for many years. And it was particularly heightened in the 80s or so, when I became really interested in systematically thinking about a topic that, of course, I had studied in graduate school. We all study issues of what's called Jewish historiography, or how does one study the history of the Jews? And this is part of the larger study of how is history studied generally. And as in the case of Jewish history, Jews and others have written a great deal about the challenge of writing Jewish history and the history of writing Jewish history. The writing of Jewish history took a dramatic turn, as many of you know, in the 19th century, when there developed an interest in critical history of the Jews. And perhaps one of the best ways this new development was captured is in a book by many people know, by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, somebody with whom Dr. Samuelson also worked, and his book, Zachor, Jewish Memory and Jewish History. Yerushalmi in the book discusses the tension between traditional ways Jews selectively referred to aspects of their past and thereby created what's called collective memory, their collective or social understanding who they are, and the tension of that between that way of remembering the past and the emergent trends of critical study of the history of the Jews, to say the way it really happened, that developed in the 19th century. And so in the 1980s or so, I began to think seriously about this and did a great deal of reading and taught a number of courses at ASU in a graduate seminar on collective and social memory, and published several essays on the topic, including one on the teaching of Jewish history, on the role of heroes in Jewish history teaching. And I published what, in fact, was, until this day, still the only full-length article on the role of local Jewish historical societies. And it was based upon some basic reading I had done in the field, some things I had learned about the emergence of local and ethnic historical societies, particularly in America, from the time of the founding of the Republic until more recent times, when you had things like the Massachusetts Bay Historical Society, until the founding of much more local societies. And so I wrote this article, and I came up with the notion, to which I'll return towards the end of my presentation, of local Jewish historical societies as sources and resources for the study of Jewish history, and particularly for the study of local Jewish history. I put aside that topic for a while, and then a colleague of mine, Jonathan Friedman, who's a professor of Jewish music and Jewish history, and has published extensively, especially on the field of Jewish music, he had himself become the head of what's called the Southern California Jewish Historical Society initially, and had become the Western Jewish Historical Society, which also published a journal. The journal had various names: the Journal of Western Jewish History, or Western Jewish History in its most recent manifestation. And he was interested in writing about the history of that group. I shared with him, well, I had done some work on this issues of local Jewish historical societies. And so we came up with the idea of maybe we should write on this. We thought that, in fact, knowing a little bit about the field and the existence of such societies, they're an interesting aspect itself of American Jewish history. And so we came up with this book, which will be coming out, and it contains an essay, which I'll refer to a little bit today, which provides the overview of the history of these societies, and then essays on the Southern California Jewish Historical Society, the Southern Jewish Historical Society, the Rhode Island, Arizona, and Rocky Mountain, and Michigan Historical Society. And it is the first book that actually systematically tries to talk about these as an aspect of American Jewish history itself. So what can we say about these societies and their emergence? What I try to argue in my paper in the book is that, in fact, the emergence of Jewish historical societies in the early 50s is one of three important developments that took place during the decades of the 1940s and the 1950s. And all the developments in some way point to this tension, which I'm going to talk about, between doing critical historiography, writing history in such a way with no vested interest in trying to make a case of what really happened and what factors may have caused those events to happen, what the players really were driven by, compared to those who like to write history for the purposes of celebrating their past, or primarily for the purposes of promoting the identities of those who might be interested in learning about, in this case, Jewish history. So as just mentioned, there are three important developments that occur in the 40s and 50s, and I won't go into them in detail, but the three are, and I think in some ways are interrelated. The first is the whole effort to try to raise the standards of the study of American Jewish history, or what would say the emergence of a much more critical approach to the study of American Jewish history, and the appreciation of the study of American Jewish history as an important chapter and component in the larger history of the Jews. The second development is the celebration of the tercentennial of the arrival of Jews in America, which is dated to 1654. The tercentennial took place in 1954 and was on a major national level, celebrating the history of the Jews in America. And the third development, which will be our focus, is on the emergence of local Jewish historical societies, a number of which, including those I've mentioned, which from the 50s to the 60s, Rhode Island, Southern California, Michigan, all took shape in that period of time. I won't go into great detail about how the study of American Jewish history was promoted in the 40s and 50s, but there are, in fact, several key players, academics, who played a role in this. Perhaps the most important of them is somebody also who has a deep connection to ASU, the efforts of Sela Baron, who taught at Columbia, in fact, prior to Yosef Yerushalmi. Baron held the first official appointed to teach Jewish history in all American universities. And many of you may be familiar with Baron's 18-volume social history of the Jews and his numerous writings. One can say that Baron, looking around what was going on at that time in the study of American Jews, recognized several things. There had been the American Jewish Historical Society, which was founded in the 1890s, and it was an effort largely of history buffs, amateurs, people who had a deep interest in studying the history of Jews in America, but perhaps mostly for the purposes of promoting their own identity as Jews and for enhancing the acceptance of Jews as part of the American community and nation as a whole. They sustained the journal, which came out initially called Proceedings of the American Jewish Historical Society. They had sustained this journal for 50 years, but the society as a whole had largely limped along. The history of the AJHS has been written by some, and the history of the publication, which then changed names to American Jewish History from the Proceedings. But Barone had this notion, in part driven by the recognition of what was going on in Europe in the early 40s, that the centrality of and the importance of the American Jewish community will rise given the unfortunate circumstances of the decimation of Jewish life in Europe, and particularly of numerous educational institutions that had been developed in Europe already, as noted, from the 19th century on. And so Barone had a sense there really was a need to try to make the study of American Jewish history important. Now, Barone himself, like virtually everybody, had not been trained in American Jewish history, because nobody was at this point in time. And in fact, this is one of his goals, was not only to promote the scholarship, but to begin to train students in American Jewish history studies, using his appointment at Columbia to do so, and in time also developing connections to the school next door, the Jewish Theological Seminary, which, and working with Professor Moshe Davis to pursue that goal. The other two figures who play a major role in this, and the interrelationships between the three of them are complicated, supportive, and at times fractious. The second important figure, of course, is Jacob Rader Marcus, who also was trained as a European historian, had become an historian at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and taught courses on Jewish history. And he also ended up becoming a scholar of American Jewish history. Barone was more connected to the American Jewish Historical Society. Marcus, who also had those connections, in time founded a parallel kind of institution, at least in terms of its importance as being a central archive for documents related to American Jews. That is the founding of the American Jewish Archives at the Hebrew Union College. Without going into details here, Marcus recognized that, as he said, there still may be an important place for amateurs or somewhat amateurs, amateurs/professionals in writing American Jewish history. And so he often had rabbinic students who had to write a rabbinic thesis, do something related to American Jewish history. The third figure, and again, this is a whole other chapter of great interest, was Oscar Handlin, who was a professor at Harvard. And he also, his actually scholarly writings, which dealt with immigration, rarely, if not at all, talked about Jews, but he had to use the phrase a Yiddish neshama, a Jewish soul, and was deeply interested in American Jews. And he became also interested, for his own reasons, in promoting the study of American Jews. The takeaway from all this is that we have this significant emergence of a serious effort at writing about the history of Jews in America. However, and each of these figures sought to situate the study of American Jews as part of the study both of the history of the Jews as a global phenomenon, that is, to contribute to what had become by the 1940s and 50s the larger field of Jewish historical societies, and to see American Jews as another example in the long history of the Jews from biblical times onwards, and also to situate the study of American Jews within the broader study of American history in general. That was the sort of academic goal. But as you can sense, there was also something of a Jewish drive to all this. They each in their own ways thought that a reconstruction, accurate reconstructions and understandings of the American Jewish experience would benefit American Jews as well. They shared the conviction that healthy Jewish identity is informed by a deep knowledge of the past of the Jews. And the more one can gain a sense of what really happened with Jews, one may be able to determine not only what are the factors that are shaping Jewish life today, but they may also draw upon that knowledge to define what it means to be a Jew. They shared the conviction that in some ways was already founded in the 19th century, that identity, promoting identity, was deeply tied to an understanding of the past. Now, to return to Yerushalmi, these two goals of engaging in historical research without any vested interest and commitment to contribute to the knowledge of the human condition stands in tension with what are often seen as much more parochial goals of promoting local identities or even national identities. This is a much larger topic, and one can argue the same tensions existed even within the American Historical Society or the Mississippi Valley Historical Association, the two early societies that were founded to promote the study of American history. And without getting into contemporary political events, one can still easily see this tension between we're interested in telling the story of the United States as best as we can, as critically we can, to best understand what has shaped the history of the United States, or do we seek to teach the history of America so as to promote people's commitment and patriotism and identity with America? And often, I think, as one can easily see, those two goals can fairly readily conflict with each other. So I hope this provides, I hope this information provides some sense of the context out of which American Jewish historical societies emerged. These same tensions were also found in the celebration of the tercentenary. Again, activities to which Marcus and Handlin and Barone all contributed as well. In the case of the tercentenary, the celebration of American Jews and their contributions, a key word often used, to the American experience, was perhaps far more prominent than the serious academic study of Jews in America. Though Barone, for example, saw this as an occasion to commission a number of serious studies of American Jewish history. So the tercentenary also in many ways concretizes or gives expression to that tension between the critical historiography and the more vested parochial interest in studying history for the purposes of promoting identities. With that context and broader setting, let me say a little bit about then the actual history of local American Jewish regional historical societies. So let me start, since I mentioned Rhode Island, with the following. Since the early 1950s, local and regional societies served as an integral part of the American Jewish landscape, providing community outreach, housing archives, fostering research, and publishing historical studies. The mission statement of the Rhode Island Jewish Historical Association, founded in 1951, and as noted, the first of these societies, serves as a template for the dozens of other groups that have this title and mission as well. The Rhode Island Jewish Historical Society's mission is to procure, collect, and preserve books, records, pamphlets, letters, manuscripts, prints, photographs, paintings, and other items of other historical material relating to the history of the Jews of Rhode Island to encourage and promote the study of the history of this history by lectures and otherwise, and by the publication and by publications, and to diffuse this information as to this story itself. So that's goals are very similar if you read the mission statements of nearly all these historical societies. They all have some of the same goals in mind: archiving, preserving materials, enhancing the study of the people whose documents we've now collected, enhancing that study often through various kinds of programming, lectures, exhibits, and publications of various sorts. Since the 1950s, at least 45 local and regional Jewish historical societies have been formed. Of these groups, roughly 40 are still active in one form or another. I came to learn of them through the study of their websites, contacting individual directors, using normal modes of historical research. These societies, as noted, have similar goals to that of that of Rhode Island, and similar histories to them as well. Most were founded by a small group of local individuals, some with some degree of leadership in the local community, somewhat more marginal to the local Jewish community, but often a very small group of people, 6 to 8. Some were kind of local historical buffs, some may have been lawyers, and they were often joined not as representative of their institutions by perhaps a local rabbi or somebody who worked in the Jewish communal structure at the Federation, for example. And usually 6 to 8 people came up with this idea and tried to advance it in varying ways. In many cases, as is in the case of the Rhode Island Jewish Historical Society, as it's been written about in their own journal, the archive for a long time was in the trunk of the car of its founder, who sought hard to try to find somebody who would take on the mantle of leadership after he had done it for any number of years. The story of the survival of these groups is itself fascinating, given their somewhat precarious existence from the times of their initial foundings. And they actually have diverse relationships to the broader communal establishments within the local communities of which they are a part. Some of these societies over time, or I should say early on, decided to have interesting, beyond archiving, decided to have interesting publications. But before I turn to publications, a little bit about the archiving. The archives were kept at varying degrees of professional archiving, generally not very well preserved. And the only person, they did not have a formal list of what they held. In time, some of the historical societies created relationships to a local, either the local library, that was the case initially in Detroit, or with academic institutions. For example, the Rocky Mountain Association always had a relationship to the University of Denver. And so the archiving material was done in quite a professional manner from the start. Most of the societies also were primarily statewide, as Indiana or Rhode Island, and other such groups as well, New Mexico, Texas. There were a few such societies which were regional. The largest and most successful of them that still continues to today is the Southern Jewish Historical Society, which sees itself as a society encompassing the region from Maryland to Texas, even as there are several local Jewish historical societies within this area. Some of these societies in time as they collected material, sought to display it. And in varying ways, they promoted, held displays or programs. They put up a show, again, with varying degrees of professionalism in connection with museum studies. And in the case of some of the historical societies over time, they ceased to be so much historical societies as they became Jewish museums. That is the case, for example, of what was initially the Maryland Jewish Historical Society based in Baltimore, which now has become the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and the same too for the Historical Society in Washington, D.C., and the Jewish Historical Society in Oregon. And they have a much more prominent face as Jewish museums to this day, with varying quality to the programs they offer. As noted, also, these societies also published journals. The best of them, I would say, is the Southern Jewish History, which is a really fine journal, according to the criteria of academic credentials and qualifications for what it means to write good history. Rhode Island Jewish Historical Notes. The Michigan Jewish History is still published, Indiana Jewish History, and now Western Jewish History has been revived as well. So in some ways, these societies actually have produced serious scholarship, or if not serious analyses, which I'll mention in a minute, they often have been able to at least accumulate valuable data and information that would be of use to historians who want to write about the history of the locale. Let me move forward very quickly then to speak to, so what kind of messages or analyses of the history of the local area did these groups promote? In many ways, first and foremost, the historiography, what they did was exceedingly descriptive. So-and-so came here, he lived here, he did X, Y, and Z. This society, this group, local synagogue was founded in, and lots of information, often well organized, often accompanied by fine documentation. One of the great parts of historical societies is many people contribute photographs, so they can do a great job of writing kind of descriptive history of a location. What they wrote about tended to be more celebratory. They didn't talk as much about the role of Jews, let's say, in illicit behavior or in gangsters or in other activities which didn't make the Jews look so good. And so the selectivity is also part of, even if the articles or the shows were fairly accurate, they didn't provide a full picture of what was really going on in the local community. What is particularly, so there's a high celebratory value of this. Sometimes it's called what's called filial-pietistic. I want to talk about my grandfather, who was an important figure. And while that may be of some interest to some, that's not the kind of critical historiography people do. Critical historiography, and this is sort of both what Barone and Marcus noted, is driven by a sense of looking at the range of factors, be they social, political, economic, cultural, that actually shape the people's choices, and equally as much contextualizing or locating the local within broader national or international developments. And so many people, for example, critical Jewish historical studies, while it may offer a very detailed study of a particular location at a specific time, in academic work, that would involve also situating those developments in broader aspects of both the broader history of the Jews, as well as within the history of the locations of which they're a part, talking about relationships to other political or social entities, etc. That kind of critical history is somewhat lacking, of course, in local Jewish historical societies. often due to the fact that those who are involved in those groups are not full-time historians, lack training in historiographical methodologies, etc. So is this to say then, this is to say in one way, I would argue the tension between the critical study of history and the more local promotion of Jewish identity is a factor that speaks to the nature of local Jewish historical societies. Of the people who have talked about them, other than myself, there's a nice essay by Jonathan Sarno, which he published in the Rhode Island Jewish Historical Notes. But Hasia Diner, who just retired as a professor of American Jewish history at NYU, and a number of years ago at a meeting of the Polish American Society, spoke about her own life experiences of what she said, what she characterized as the tension of trying to speak to two masters. And she talked about her own experiences of being invited to give lectures. And she often felt that, especially by local Jewish groups or by Jewish organizations, and she felt that her task was to sort of promote, look how good the Jews have been. And she felt at times that's really very much in tension with her role as an American historian who particularly focuses on American Jewish history. And her piece is quite fascinating as she captures well some of this tension between these two goals. Let me end then by specifically speaking to, so what is the value of these kinds of societies and what they do? And I return here to my comments or the title I chose for the essay that I wrote a number of years ago on local historical societies as sources and resources for American Jewish history. By sources, I meant several things. As already noted, and perhaps as this book we're putting out speaks to, they're a source, an aspect of the American Jewish experience. And understanding them, it contributes to the broader understanding of American Jewish history. How do they reflect local trends? How they reflect national trends? These are important aspects of American Jewish history. And so they're a source for that information as well. They're also resources. As mentioned, they preserve, and as Dr. Samuelson had mentioned, they preserve invaluable documentation for anyone who seriously would like to write about American Jewish history. They are rich archives and more over time better preserved with access lists so that people don't have to, if you ask for something, only the archivist knows that in box 27 on the shelf over there might have the information you want, but you could actually now, and we're beginning to see this more and more online listings of the archives holdings of particular local Jewish historical societies. So they're rich resources. They also can be resources in holding programs and promoting the study of the local community. But equally as well, I would suggest that local Jewish historical societies are still Jewish institutions that serve specifically Jewish interests and needs. And in one of the chapters, as noted, and as Chava mentioned, is authored by the current director of the Arizona Jewish Historical Society, Larry Bell, who actually did his BA at ASU and a PhD at Ohio State, and then came back and is running the Arizona Jewish Historical Society. For those of you who are local in Arizona, I think you might find this chapter of interest. And I can say that of the local Jewish historical societies, Arizona stands at the forefront of having a rich amount of programming, interesting programming of the various natures. And perhaps this is a good way to end, is a good example as well of cooperative relationships between the university and the local community as we can pursue mutual interests, seeking to better understand the importance and the history of Jews in Arizona. Similarly, the same activity case would hold for whether it's Rhode Island, etc. So I hope this has given a little overview of these groups, some of what they do, and some of the factors that stand in a certain sense of, I would hope to say, a healthy tension as they go forward and continue to thrive and serve a variety of communities at the same time. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you, Joel. This was fascinating, and I think I would like to follow up with a few questions, and then we'll see. I see that we have 2 questions already in the Q&A. So let me pose some more general questions about, because you're an American historian as much as you are an historian of American Jewish life. So what, it's a bit provocative, but on purpose. So in your view, what do Jews need to do, or what do we need to do in order to have Jews take Jewish history essential to being Jewish? In other words, that may have been very obvious in the 40s and 50s. It may be a little bit less obvious today. So if you can reflect on that, and I would suggest bringing into the conversation the secular nature of Jewish history as opposed to religious life of Jews. So if you can reflect on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question. If you ask the premise of the question is, I think, what we need to somewhat deconstruct or sort of think about a little bit more. And I would say, first of all, I think there's an interesting tension, and you and I both have lived this tension. And I teach this when I start, and I ask students, is there a difference between writing the history of the Jews and writing a history of Judaism? And there clearly is, and there are different methodologies and different set of assumptions. Now, even saying there's a history to Judaism itself is a provocative claim for many. That is, many people would like to think of Judaism as a sense, a timeless phenomenon, or the essential truths of what Judaism is stand outside of history. If you subscribe to the notion that God created the Torah 2,000 years before he even created the world, then that's outside of time. And so whatever Judaism is in its essence, which is an interesting concept, right, isn't affected by history, or to the degree to which there's some kind of history to Judaism, it's not in its key factors. As you well know, and I think many here know, right, it is the 19th century that pushed this idea that, in some ways, as I like to put it, the arbiter of Jewish identity should be the historian, not the rabbi. The rabbi may know things, but his rabbinic or her rabbinic training doesn't equip her to be an historian. And this tension has run deep. I don't think, in a sense, particularly as it relates to, let's tell it as it really was. That's really a real tension for those who want to promote identities in some ways. And I think every one of us struggles with this to what degree. First of all, do people value history? Do people value any kind of history? Do they live in generalized, big generalizations? The old generalization, tell you Jewish history in 3 seconds, they try to kill us, right? And either they nearly succeeded, so let's fast, or they tried to kill us and we won, so let's go party. And okay, I'll go through all of Jewish history in 1 second, and I don't care about what was going on in the actual details of the Jews in Italy in the 1500s compared to what may be going on and pick a different location in which Jews lived at that time, which may have had a very different set of historical circumstances. So I do wonder. So, you know, a lot of people say Jews have an historical religion, but I very much deeply question that. And my own sense is, if you look at contemporary, let's say, American Jews, there is many people are still quite content with focusing on a very limited number of events as definitional as critical, and the interest in really studying the complexity of Jewish history, studying, and I think this is a broader issue in America, and it's something we all struggle with, those of us who teach humanities and teach history, is to what degree are students or people in general interested in serious history. Now, that's not to say lots of people love to go to local museums and see what they do, and people travel and do that kind of thing. But I think there's a big difference between that. So I don't have a, you know, I think all these associations still limp along in some ways, and I'm dubious of the seriousness with which American Jews and even Americans in general are willing to confront history. And again, to just return to my point about contemporary discussions going on in the political realm of the United States, the issue is very much prominent. While yes, it's important to talk about the past, but to use the phrase "whose past" really matters. And you know, let me stop there. I don't know if that answered your question adequately.
Yeah, no, I think it does, but I would like a different angle on the same question. Has to do with the professionalization of Jewish studies in America, and that really took off since the 1970s. So now we have Association of Jewish Studies. I think about 2,000 people are members or something of that you know, range. So what is the role of local historical societies given the professionalization of the study of Judaism in the academy?
So it's interesting. We chose for the people we asked to write the chapters, directors, all of whom have PhDs, all of whom have academic training, and have academic training that equips them to really engage with local Jewish history in a serious way. But that's not true of all the local Jewish historical societies. Let me try this at a different angle, which is really interesting. I didn't get to talk about this point. The question on one level is, if we looked at all the local Jewish historical societies and asked how many of them are also members of the AJS, the Association of Jewish Studies, my sense is few. Most do not belong, which is professors of Jewish studies at universities. Most people will belong to the AJS. What's interesting also in this regard is that the local Jewish museums actually have a national professional organization called CAJM. It's the Council of American Jewish Museums. American Jewish Archivists, there isn't a Jewish Archive Association, but there's actually an association of archivists. There is no association that brings together all the local Jewish Historical Society directors. For whatever reasons, they've never done that. I suspect some of them are involved in the American Jewish Historical Society, but I'm not sure how many do so. So I think and to what degree that's their own personal choice. I don't think, my quick answer would be, I don't think that the local supporters of the Historical Society, in some sense, see it as critical that their directors be actively involved in the broader field of Jewish studies. The other point that's really interesting that I learned along the way, even with regard to the efforts at local of trying to professionalize the study of American Jews, that is particularly the efforts of those who promoted the American Jewish Historical Association, as well as the American Jewish Archives. In their initial period, when these societies were founded in the 50s, it's interesting that supposedly the American Jewish Historical Society had a relationship with several of the local Jewish historical societies. Or in the journals published by, for example, Southern and Indiana and Michigan, you had greetings from Jacob Braden Marcus. I had the privilege of talking to Bernard Wax, who for many years was the director of the American Jewish Historical Society. And I asked him, is this real? He said, never really happened. That is, and this is what's really interesting, both the AJA, the American Jewish Archives, and the American Jewish Historical Society, as they themselves, I think, in some way were caught in this tension between trying to be part of the larger academic world, as well as being interested in Jewish interests. They never, these were the local historical societies were orphan children and not of any great significance to them. So the interesting payoff of that, of which now somebody's written on as well, a fascinating study, is the diffusion of archives in American Jewish, of archives relevant to the study of Jews of America. And whatever the American Jewish Historical Society or American Jewish Archives collected, the point is they never seriously tried to become the central archives for the Jews of America. And so now you've got important materials, significant archives related to American Jewish history, which are dispersed across everywhere in the United States. So in some ways, I think this is, there's not a great push to say we want to be part of this larger field of the Jewish studies. And it varies among the directors of local Jewish historical societies themselves.
Okay, let's see if we have some questions or comments. Can you look at the Q&A?
I don't know if Lisa is you there? If you, oh, I could try to read them.
Yeah, the first question by Diane Birnbaum was about the relationship between local historical societies and Jewish museums. And she's referring particularly to the one in Berkeley, where the Magnus Museum performed.
Yes,
functions that you attribute to historical society.
So that's I just saw a note to the question. Yes, thank you. Our colleague Rachel Moore mentioned also that there's also the Association of Jewish Librarians, which also, since these historical societies are libraries, they have a collection and can meet together. The Berkeley connection and the what's now called the Magnus Museum has itself a very fascinating history to it. It was also very much the effort of a particular individual, and in time, it actually never called itself a local Jewish historical society. It had this slightly different identity to it, and I had a chance to also talk to Fred Rosenbaum, who served in a very key role in that association for many years. And he shared with me some of the history of what became the Magnus and how the Seymour, forgetting his last name, was the founder. And in some ways, it's a very important archive. And it's interesting to compare, I would say here, the interests of that group, which identified itself more regionally than the Southern California, which had a more local. And to what degree these two Californian associations really cooperated with each other is an interesting story itself. The other person, of course, who I think is very important in the history of that group is Moses Rishon, who taught at San Francisco State for any number of years, and who really sought to bring an academic quality to the study of local Californian history. But it now I would say the Magnus is very important as a fine collection of materials. Its programming is much thinner than some of the other groups in its own ways. And Magnus in Time is now part of Cal Berkeley, and that's who technically holds the materials itself. I don't know if that quite answered the question, but it's a very interesting group to look into.
Let's see, we have another questions on the Q&A. Can you take a look? Oh, this is just a comment. Okay, about Simmer's last name was Frommer.
Sima Frommer. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So I will pose another question, and that has, how do you see the, I'm sure you are all familiar with the fact that we give the Baron Dissertation Award to young scholars, and we do it every 3 years. And people submit their work to us, and we choose what we consider the most distinguished. So my question to you is, do you find among young scholars of American Jewish history a different orientation today in the second decade of the 21st century than what it was, let's say, in previous decades? What is new, and what are they doing that they didn't do before? My total intuitive sense is, or impressionistic sense is, that yes, there is a difference. And I think it's connected to the secular identity that I raised earlier.
I would agree with you entirely. I think the thing to say is that one of the dramatic transformations in Jewish studies, and it varies from field to field, areas of Jewish studies, is the emergence of more non-Jews who are interested and trained to study the history of Jews. Now, this, of course, is something that in certain fields like Holocaust studies has been there from the start. If you define Holocaust studies as World War II studies, then people who study modern Germany, modern European history, may or may not have an interest in the study of the aspects of the war that related to Jews. And that's a whole interesting study itself. But some of these topics have moved to be far more mainstream. You'll have articles on the Jews published in the mainline journals themselves, not just in journals devoted to the study of Jews and Judaism. And equally, you have any number of people who, for whatever motivates people to want to study the history of some group or location, especially what motivates people who, in a sense, don't have any particular background or connection to these people. That's a fascinating subject. Why do colleagues of ours who aren't Chinese want to study China or whatever locale? But there are more and more people who recognize and have come to study whatever aspects of Jewish history that interest them. And that's true of American Jewish history as well. Without overstating the importance of American Jews within the American experience, but they're an important aspect of the American Jewish experience. And so there are topics and issues and ways of framing the questions that treat the Jews in America as part of the larger study of the American Jews. Of course, in the academic world, the books and articles are not written for them to say, and therefore we as Jews know what we're supposed to be like as Jews in America. That's not the intentionality of the book. And I think that's the apologetics that often typify that it's to make the case look how good the Jews are and have been, which was very much central to the founders of the American Jewish Historical Society. And in no way do I mean to critique them. In some ways, it's a product of the comfort with which many Jews feel in America today, that they don't have to run around talking about the contributions of what Jews have done to America, or to bury the less desirable aspects of the Jewish past. And as some of us grew up, the first thing, if you read an article in the paper and it wasn't so good, you say, phew, the person wasn't Jewish. I think people now accept that, Jews are like everybody else. So the field as a whole has gone off in these kinds of directions. And some of the more contemporary trends in the study of history and social developments are also at play in the study of Jews in America. Some of the trends that other people don't necessarily see as so advantageous, looking at Jews both in their positive and, to take the classic example of the role of Jews, since I mentioned Newport, right? The role of Jews in the history of the slave trade in the colonies. Well, that's true, but what do we make of that? How do we understand that? And does that have any bearing on my social status in America? I think that's changed dramatically. So scholars of Jewish American history are trained in, this is what's interesting, perhaps compared to Barone and Marcus. People are now trained as American historians, and their focus happens to be Jews in America or ethnic groups in America or whatever their particular topic is.
Yes. Yeah.
I think you've trained some of them yourself.
As you were talking, I was. Yeah, of course. But I was thinking it's a very interesting comparison. I don't believe that anybody has done it between Jewish studies in America and African-American studies in America, or what is now going under critical race theory. Where are the differences? Where are the similarities?
Absolutely.
It's a very complex issue, something for us to look at in a more comparative perspective.
But can I add one other point that's really interesting is the study of local ethnic societies or even ethnic associations like the American Polish Society or the American local chapters. There's virtually no scholarship on them either. So these are interesting aspects of study of American history that still are somewhat marginal. Yeah, I don't know of anything. There's a lot of work being done now on Jews and African Americans and comparisons and post-colonial studies, but I think it's just emerging.
I agree. So you have another question if you look at the Q&A about your coming book.
What did it specifically ask? I didn't pull it up. Maybe if you could read it.
It is, when does Dr. Gerboff expect his new book to be available?
I hope it's out. One always deals with the foibles of publishing. We anticipate it being out by April.
Oh, okay. I thought it's earlier.
Well, it depends, on the production schedule. It's already mid-February. It could be next month, but I'm pretty sure it'll be out by April. But this reality that some publishers are far better than others at.
Oh, absolutely. But it's interesting. The question comes from Emily Garber, who is herself a genealogist and does a wonderful work on Jewish genealogy. And we, in the public lectures of Jewish studies, have featured the work of her collaborator, Janet Silverman, and herself as well, as kind of related issues. So the interest in genealogy and the interest in the Jewish historical past are, of course, intertwined and should be intertwined. It's not one or the other. You have to do both.
I think, thank you for mentioning that. I should add, I was involved at the time that the Arizona Jewish Historical Society was emerged, became involved with I was on the board for a while, in fact, and the Arizona Historical Society has its own interesting history, and the overlap of a figure we know very important to ASU of Rabbi Plotkin and his wife Sylvia in both associations is a fascinating study. But it is the case that the Arizona Jewish Historical Society often had programs on Jewish genealogy. And with Dr. Robert, I'm forgetting his last name, Kravitz, very much promoting them, not to get too local.
Yes, I just had the privilege of meeting him not too long ago. I met him in person.
There is, I believe, an International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies. I spent some time on their webpage, and so exactly at a local level, are they part of, cooperate with, do they operate separate from? These are sort of local factors, but there's no question the study of genealogy is both out of personal interest. I want to know where my ancestry comes from, or I want to really ask a much more serious kind of question that not, or it's a question that's larger than my own personal history. These are very important data, and of course the resources for doing that. That's a whole interesting chapter, and I defer to those who know this far better when you want to trace Jewish genealogy, but it's part of the study of the history of Jews in any place.
Absolutely, yes. And we had several, as I said, we had several programs about it. So let me see. I don't think that we have new questions. So if anybody would like to propose any other question, please put it in the Q&A. In the meantime, I would like to remind all of you that on March 13, a very famous sociologist of the Jews in America, and that's Professor Jack Wertheimer from JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York. He will be delivering an important lecture here to us, really taking a look at at kind of the American chapter of Jewish history. The title of his presentation is Community in Transition or Decline, ? And the subtitle is The Polarized Debate Over American Jewish Life Today. So here's another example of a person who is both a religious studies scholar as well as a sociologist of religion, as well as an American historian, trying to put it all together. I highly recommend that all of you attend that lecture, which will be in person as well as on Zoom on March.
If I could just add a footnote, of course, Dr. Wertheimer also teaches at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And so as well as sort of in this tension between, am I writing primarily for historians of America, am I writing for historians of Jews, or am I equally training rabbis so that they have a better sense of the communities with whom they're going to interact and serve? So it's again, these need not be totally conflicting roles, but there are often tensions among them.
Yeah, good, very, very good point. I agree with you. Well, we will explore all of it with him. So if we don't have other, no, we do have a new question. Let me see what it says. From Rachel Leckett-Moore, does the book relate to the tensions between historical societies and Jewish archives in academic libraries that ingested their collections? Ingested is an interesting word.
No,
absorbed.
I love the question. Thank you, Rachel, for asking that. There is a book by, I can't remember, it was Lisa Kessler. It's just coming out. She published a piece in the American Jewish Archives, American Jewish History a number of years ago. And her book is now coming out. I want to say it's actually Lisa Kaplan, but then I got maybe the two of you confused there. And it actually studies the history of the efforts to create a national archive among Jews, and to what degree those are university-based or not. Of course, the American Jewish Historical Society's archive has its own fascinating history, which has been written about, where it started and ended up getting housed in time in Waltham on the campus of Brandeis University, despite it initially being sort of connected to Jewish Theological Seminary, and now is part of the Center for Jewish History in New York, which is equally as much an academic institution, but also in some ways a communal institution housing the work of a number of groups here. I don't know of anybody. So there's a history of the internal frictions of archiving American Jewish documents, and particularly on a national level. On a local level, as I said, I think there are variations here. A number of societies decided they don't have the skills to really archive their material well, or the resources for doing it. And so they developed relationships with varying universities to host the archive. In some cases, though, the society hosts them. And I don't know, I would require a different kind of research to really start talking to the archivists and to learn from them about what's their relationships to local universities and more archivists. Some of the archivists, by the way, are professionally trained. They have degrees in library science and or PhDs in archival studies, and some of them are kind of self-taught local people who develop skills along the way, but often somewhat limited. And I'd say, I guess if I underscored it, the tension and anybody who does history and has to go to archives is the tension between it's only the archivist knows where everything is, and you better stay on the archivist's good side, otherwise you'll never get to see the material, versus a much more professional sense that the archives have now been digitized, which is a major but very costly development, to move to digitizing all kinds of records and having all the records listed. If you go to the catalog of the university, the electric online catalog, you can find the papers of so-and-so listed. And I think that's still a reality of life in any kind of serious archiving work.
Speaking of that, I see that Emily Garber has placed another comment here that one of the important new projects of jewishgen.org is to compile an inventory of synagogue records at archives or in archives.
Yeah, I mean, that's also fascinating is there's no question of many of these historical societies preserved the records of various local Jewish institutions, synagogues, many of which, of course, ceased to exist or combined with others. And the amount of information potentially available if somebody wants to sit and read weekly bulletins or rabbinic sermons or the minutes of meetings. But I think the question is, and maybe it's a good way of kind of pulling this up, who's really interested in knowing the history of synagogue X? And what does it speak to? And perhaps as I started to think of that, and it kind of, we have a perfect example here in Phoenix, where several of our colleagues, and I think in cooperation with the Arizona Jewish Historical Society as well, I think they were part of that, have engaged in a project to talk about the history of Beth Hebrew congregation in Phoenix.
I was one of those people who were on this project.
So maybe you could speak quickly to what's the significance of writing. In other words, so if archives collect all these documents out of an organization, which can vary as to how detailed they are and how complete they are, why would Beth Hebrew congregation, who would be interested in of knowing that, how you might use the documentation about it?
So actually, that's to me, I thought it was a very interesting project, and we collaborated. It was a large group of people. Some of them are Holocaust studies, some of them are public historians, some of them are historians of education. Me as a Jewish historian, and I probably forget one or two. So we were we had some.
I think Volker was part of that, wasn't he?
Yeah, Volker was the lead scholar, Volker Benkert. And it was a beautiful project, excellent essay that appeared in the University of Arizona Public History Journal. I don't remember the precise title, but the point is that here people can do Jewish history or history of Jewish institutions, in this case, Beth Hebrew, which is absolutely fascinating because it's a synagogue that was later used by other non-Jewish communities, both a Black theater group and a Hispanic community. So, and now it's back in Jewish hands. So how do we tell that story? How do we understand the history of the place, in this case, Phoenix, the history of the Jewish community, post-World War II? All of those issues together, absolutely fascinating story. So yes, this is an example how a lot of people actually can contribute and can deepen our understanding of Jewish history if we work together. So that would be kind of the moral of the story from this Beth Hebrew, and maybe we should do a separate program just on Beth Hebrew. That's actually an idea.
Well, it sort of speaks to the title of the book. All history is local, but if it's good history, its importance exceeds just the understanding of the local.
Absolutely. And the local is always not just local, because people, especially in Phoenix, are from all over, literally from all over the world, people coming here. So I guess with that, we can bring this fascinating time that we spent together in the middle of the day. Here we are studying Jewish history or thinking about Jewish history, with one nod again to the book that you mentioned by Yerushalmi. When Yerushalmi in the book Zachor, he kind of juxtaposes collective, as you said, the collective memory versus doing history. I'm not sure that we really need to look at it just as a juxtaposition or as a tension. Maybe the time has come to look for more integrative model, that we do need both. We need the historical analysis and the collective memory. And as we move into the soon are going to be in the third decade of the 20th century, what does it mean to be Jewish? Can we be Jewish without historical identity? No. Can we do it without any kind of ritual commitment? No. So what needs to happen as we move forward in the 21st century? So we can think about it again when Dr. Wertheimer will visit us in March. And until then, and actually until the next program, which is Rabbi Richard Adres on Monday at 12. I really wish you a very wonderful weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in future programs of Jewish Studies. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel.